Hello, I'm Roya Nikkhah and welcome to the Royals from the Times and the Sunday Times. I think it's fair to say that after the past week, the British monarchy is no longer the monarchy it was. Something has changed. At 7 o'clock last Friday evening, Buckingham Palace issued a statement. Short, formal, but seismic. Prince Andrew has relinquished his royal titles and honours, principally his title as the Duke of York, and his membership of the Order of the Garter, the United Kingdom's highest order of chivalry. A voluntary surrender of his titles, forced by pressure both public and private. Intended to draw a line under more than 20 years of controversy over the allegations about his links with the convicted sex offender Giuffre Epstein. But if that was the palace's hope, it's had the opposite effect. What's followed has been a cascade of criticism, not just of Prince Andrew, as he's still called, but from some quarters of the palace's handling of this affair. We've since learned that Andrew pays what's been described in documents as a peppercorn rent for Royal Lodge, his sprawling home on the Windsor estate, a revelation uncovered by The Times that's only added fuel to the fire. And last night, the King returned to London, home from an historic visit to Rome, where this week he became the first British monarch since the Reformation to pray publicly alongside a Pope at the Vatican. It was a moment crafted to project moral leadership and unity on the world stage. But now, in the shadow of moral outrage at home, this week, the full details of the life of Prince Andrew's accuser were revealed. Virginia Giuffre's posthumous memoir, Nobody's Girl, is a harrowing read. The accusations against Andrew are, of course, well known, and he's always denied knowing Miss Giuffre or having sex with her. At the time of the alleged encounters, she says she was 17, a teenager drawn into the world of sexual exploitation run by Epstein. What we now see, in devastating detail, are those allegations about that world, the abuse, the coercion, the years of trafficking that trapped young women like Virginia. This is a passage from her memoir. In my years with them, they lent me out to scores of wealthy, powerful people. I was habitually used and humiliated, and in some instances, choked, beaten, and bloodied. I believed I might die a sex slave. 6 years ago, in the Newsnight interview with Prince Andrew, Emily Maitlis put forward the phrase that Giuffre's lawyer once used: "You couldn't spend time around Epstein and not know." Andrew replied that he knew what the warning signs were, but he never saw them. So what now? For the King? For the Prince who remains a prince? And what for any investigation? What did Andrew know? And what more should he do now? And a wider question: can the Crown remain a symbol of moral authority when it's forced to reckon with the conduct of one of its own? With me on the Royals is the Times investigations reporter George Greenwood and religious affairs correspondent Kaya Burgess. Both have joined me this week in examining the workings of the royal family, tracing this story from Windsor to the Vatican and asking what moral weight of the Crown really means today. Yesterday I was at the Vatican for what was a hugely symbolic act. King Charles became the first head of the Church of England to pray publicly with the Pope, praying together nearly 500 years after the Church of England split from Rome. Huge moment. How important was that, Kaya?
It's the sort of thing that just for centuries and centuries and up until very recent times would have just been totally unthinkable. I mean, not only what would Henry VIII make of it, having broken from Rome in the first place, but it's interesting, we've now got Pope Leo XIV, and it was Pope Leo XIII about 130 years ago who declared that the entire Anglican Church and all of its holy orders were, I think his phrase was, absolutely null and void. The idea even then that a British monarch, supreme governor of the Church of England, would be there praying up on the same stage as a pope in the Sistine Chapel just would have been unthinkable. And I was actually really surprised by the phrase that the royal family used afterwards. They shared some photographs on
Yeah.
social media, said this was a historic moment, and they said it marked a joining of hands between the Church of England and the Catholic Church, which is quite a choice of phrase. It's not a neutral one. It very much symbolises this, coming closer together, which, given the history, is really remarkable.
One of the really big things that the palace made in all the briefing and the run up to the visit, and it was the phrase that was used throughout from various cardinals and at various points of the visit, was this idea of brotherhood and this title that was bestowed on the king as royal confrater, sort of
Yes.
showing this brotherly unity between the Catholic Church and the Church of England. I think it was designed to sort of really ram home the idea of what a monumental occasion this was. And there was this very symbolic moment in the second service of the day, which was at St Paul outside the walls, and I was there sort of sitting and watching it all as the king was presented with this new chair, this new sort of almost sort of throne that had been designed and made for him, with a motto on it that bestowed on him this honor of being royal confrater and the joining of hands and brother of the church. And it was not lost on all of us that there was so much talk about
royal brothers
and brothership, as all of this is still raging back home.
Yeah.
And you could not get away from it, that as historic as this visit to the Vatican was, given it, it's never, you'd never had a British monarch praying with a pope before. This was all against the backdrop of what was going on with Prince Andrew. And I just wondered, in terms of sort of from the church's perspective, how much that kind of cut through.
Well, that's a great point. I mean, that King Charles has now been declared this sort of the royal brother of this basilica in Rome, and in sort of exchange, Pope Leo will be the sort of royal brother of the chapel at Windsor. And yes, mentioning royal brothers, the whole point perhaps of trying to get that statement out last Friday was the hope it wouldn't overshadow this historic moment this week. Which clearly, good luck with that. but yes, having the constant reminder of royal brothers, it did strike a certain ironic chord. I mean, the history is really fascinating, that the English crown has had this link with that very particular basilica and abbey in Rome, going back to Saxon times. Saxon kings, offer of mercy, used to give money to pay for the upkeep of the tomb of St Paul. And now to for the English monarch to have their own seat with their own coat of arms in a papal basilica is, again, an absolutely remarkable thing. Justin Welby, when he was Archbishop, had a very close relationship with Pope Francis. There are a lot of people in all churches who would love all the churches one day to reunify, which can't imagine anyone ever getting over all the various differences for that to happen. But having that all against this backdrop of what's been going on, you just have to wonder, was it the elephant in the room? Did the Pope offer, in private moments, any how's things?
I mean,
any other royal brothers we should be talking about?
You could either argue that the timing was the worst timing ever, which I think the palace sort of feared it was going to be completely, or you could argue it's quite good timing for the king, because it gave him quite a few moments of prayer and reflection.
Yes, yeah.
And my goodness me, he's had an awful lot to pray and reflect on. I want to bring you in, George, and thanks so much for joining us. We moved to Rome. I mean, the sort of the royal entourage and the whole pack moved to Rome just a day or so after you had broken a fantastic, huge story for the Times, which shed a lot of light and a few answers to the question that everyone has been asking for a very long time, which is, how on earth does Andrew still manage to live at Royal Lodge? Now, to sort of rewind, we had last Friday the announcement from Prince Andrew. I mean, Buckingham Palace put it out, but it's from Prince Andrew, that he was voluntarily giving up his titles as Duke of York and some of the other, frills like the Order of the Garter and all of that. But we didn't, and that was supposed to sort of quieten everything down. And then, if anything, you could argue that it's opened just a bigger can of worms. And the likes of you, investigations reporter, who has been, I know, doing a lot of work into Andrew over the past year, there's so many more questions to answer. But this revelation from you about Andrew's lease, which the palace have been talking about for a long time. He's got a cast iron lease. The king has tried to get him out of Royal Lodge, but he's got a cast iron lease with the Crown Estate, so the king can't force him out. I mean, you shed some amazing light on that. Tell me what you found out and how you found it.
Sure. So to take back to Sunday, myself, my colleague Tom Witherow, who did the story with, are sitting down, working for our Sunday shift, and we're thinking, well, how do we get back into this story? Everyone wants to know, okay, he's no longer going to be the Duke of York, he's no longer going to be Royal Garter. What royal public things is he doing? And one of these things is his residency of Royal Lodge. Now, The history of the lodge is very interesting. Obviously, the Queen Mother lived there until her death, and then Andrew moved in shortly after that. But while it's not necessarily a public asset in the same way as other things, it is seen as, something that really should be preserved for the nation. It's a big, almost like national trust style property. And the fact that somebody who is associated with such a terrible, notorious paedophile is living in that property, it still smacks many people as just wrong. So
who technically owns it?
So the property is a freehold and a leasehold. The freehold is owned by the Crown Estate. That is a public body owned that passes its, well, it's a private company, but it passes its income to the Treasury. So, and that manages a lot of the historic royal properties that are held in the name of the royal family. But after various reforms over the years, it was judged that this material should be used for the wider public benefit, and it pays a lot of its money that it gets to the taxman, and then that's distributed around to pay for public services, and then a portion of that money is kept back and used to fund the public works of the royal family. So
what was it that what was the revelation that you discovered that came as such a bombshell? Tell us that.
So the bombshell we discovered is he wasn't paying anything for it ongoing. So we already knew that Andrew, when he took this 75-year lease to the property in around 2003, he would have to put some money towards it. He paid about £1 million for the lease, and agreed to pay about £7.5 million for a process of upkeep, because it wasn't in great state when
a big sum.
So I think the thing is, what we can't say is Andrew hasn't put any money towards this. Obviously, we can question where that money came from. A lot of this money must have come from the sale of Sunning Hill, which was gifted to him by the Queen. But there was money paid for this property. But the question is, how good a deal has he got on this lease?
Because has the assumption been for years he's been paying market rent?
Precisely, or at least paying a rent.
Which would be what? What would be market rent for Royal Lodge?
So they did a bit of a calculation of this in 2003. Actually, there's a report by the National Audit Office around leases of this kind.
What else can you compare it to?
Well, this is the part of the problem, is that it is, we've actually been trying to do some work getting property experts to give an assessment of the value, and they struggled, but the National Audit Office helpfully did the work for us, and they calculated the notional rent on that kind of property would be around £260,000 a year.
Wow.
Now, what the value of his works to it, going back to 2003, is more like £110,000 a year. And obviously, so he's basically getting it less than half price. But of course, the money that he used to do the refurbishment, while it was his, it was granted him by the Queen. And while that's, again, not public money, it is money that you expect for the royal family to spend in their works as the royals, not necessarily in keeping their disgraced son in a very nice flat, a very nice house. Sorry.
Is the implication that actually the public purse has been losing or not maximising the full rent it could have got from Royal Lodge, and he has been paying, as you discovered, a peppercorn rent, which is, we assume, nothing?
Well, it's if you read the contract, it's actually a pepper. Sometimes you have peppercorn rents that are, £50 a year or whatever, £5 a year. The actual phrasing of the contract is a literal peppercorn per annum, if demanded. So effectively, this is sometimes the phrasing is, peppercorn rent can be confusing, but this is not actually anything being paid. It's just
you can pay rent on that just with some seasoning.
Well, you can. It's more of a legal fiction, right? It is. It's this idea that you accept that you're a tenant, own the property freehold, but you do have a right to stay there.
And how easy was it for you to get hold of that lease?
So
from the Crown Estate?
Surprisingly easy. So on the Sunday, as I said, me and Tom are talking through, well, how do we move the story forward? We have the idea, in discussion with our editors, well, why don't we just ask for a copy of the lease? They've been talking about this cast iron lease.
Let's see it.
Let's actually get a copy of it and look. And initially, the Crown Estate weren't as helpful as they might have been. They pointed us to this NAO report that gave out some of the terms of it. They also pointed us to a public version of it, which is a heavily redacted version that sits on the Land Registry. But this obviously had a lot of stuff that wasn't there. We wanted to get into the clauses. We wanted to see if it really was as cast iron has been briefed out by royal sources. So we wrote a story about it in Monday's paper, just pointing out that lots of royal experts were saying there's no reason this shouldn't be public. There's a real public interest in this being out there, so we can assess as journalists, is the allegation that it's cast iron correct? Is this a fair assessment of what it is? Is there any way that the royals might not have the stomach for, but actually to get him out of that property that is not publicly known? So we write that story in Sunday's paper with those calls, and on the Monday morning I also file a request under the Freedom of Information Act to actually start having the fight for it. So I write about a 2-page letter to them saying, there's no exemptions under the rules for disclosure that you can refuse us for. You can stonewall us if you want, but we're going to keep fighting for this.
Yeah.
And I think the combination of all that pressure from the public who are just upset by the situation, those who read our story that were just sort of saying, well, why isn't this public? And starting that legal process, I think eventually caused the Crown Estate to say, well, we're in the firing line here. We've not really done anything wrong. We're just sort of, we're stuck in the situation. So we're just going to be transparent. So Tom, in response to Tom's email of Sunday, the Crown Estate emailed me and Tom just a copy of the unredacted lease about 5 p.m. on Monday.
I mean, all of which begs the question, why hasn't the Crown Estate put that lease out before? Is there a lack of transparency here from the Crown Estate? Where is that coming from? Is there pressure coming from the palace, from the royal family? What's going on there? Well,
that's something I would love to know.
How high do you think it's likely to have been signed off as well, that could have been released?
Again, I don't know. It's really interesting, and it really begs questions around what the choreography of this, whether, for example, the Crown Estate, who is a separate body to the Crown, which I must say, that's a separate organisation, but obviously anything called the Crown Estate, there'll be royal influence in that. I don't know whether at some point someone in Buckingham Palace has just given them the nod saying, look, just get it out there now.
Yeah.
Or whether the Crown Estate took its own and said, look, we're in the firing line here. The Buckingham Palace, we don't actually have formal control of us, and we're now taking shots on this. Are we just going to proactively put it out there? But then, obviously, the real revelation compared to the version on the land registry was this peppercorn rent. And what's so shocking, as we've reported in today's paper...
You've had another story that was redacted.
It was redacted. So the version that was filed with the land registry, it's the official version that, it can be redacted for various reasons. For privacy reasons, you won't get the full document on the land registry. But my colleague Manny Medola, who worked with us on the story, talked to one of his experts and explained it's very uncommon to redact that kind of clause in a lease you file with the palace. And of course, Kate had previously seen a copy of this lease, and this part was also whited out on her version. And it's fascinating, and it does smack of someone not wanting to have to say he's living here rent free, not just in all our heads this week, but in in the property.
Yeah.
And so it's a fascinating follow-up story. Just when you put the things side by side, you suddenly go, oh no, we didn't miss this. It was just being withheld from us.
It does feel like there is a change now from official organisations who perhaps have towed a certain line, perhaps not been as transparent as they could have been. Who knows whether those came from requests from members of the royal family or from the public, but not from the public, but from the palace. But it feels like there's a bit of a line being drawn to say, something has changed. The floodgates have opened with Prince Andrew. We're going to put everything out there. So, Kaya, I want to sort of bring you back in as well, because this has become now, it's not just a sort of private problem for the palace, is it, and the king. It has become an issue for Parliament as well. We've seen Parliament drawn into it. He's voluntarily relinquished his titles for now, but that has just sort of led to clamours and calls from members of the public, from some MPs, that that's not enough, that there should be a formal act of Parliament, there should be some sort of legislation to strip him of the titles. And we now have various MPs putting forward private members' bills. We had Keir Starmer on Wednesday in the House saying he would support an inquiry into more information on the Crown Estate and the lease and his living arrangements. I thought that was a seismic move. As the king was arriving in Rome on Keir Starmer's plane, Keir Starmer was saying, I would support more inquiries on this.
Well, it's really fascinating. I mean, both with I cover the Church of England quite a lot, and with the royals, the kind of unusual constitutional role of both the Church of England being the established church, and clearly its HM government, and the degree to which Parliament can legislate for things, but it tends not to. When it came to the sex abuse scandals in the Church of England, there were MPs saying, can we, the Church of England is almost, it has an assembly which is like a devolved body of Parliament. The king gives royal assent to general synod papers in the same ways. Can MPs, take the ball by the horn, say, look, if the Church of England is being too slow to get its house in order on safeguarding and abuse, can we use our power as MPs to for private members' bills and to actually legislate and hold their feet to the fire.
There is such reticence, though, isn't there, with the royal family?
Well, exactly. So
which
now
are never spoken about in Parliament.
Well, indeed, and that whole convention, and again, it's convention.
Yeah.
Is it time that, like we've seen with the church, which for decades people probably just sort of thought, well, we don't want to be seen to be interfering in sort of church and state, despite the fact we have an established church. Is this another floodgate that's going to sort of open where MPs are going to start saying, again, like the church, if you're not going to get your own house in order, and I mean, who knows?
It feels like something has changed. I mean, you had, beginning of last week, you had Ed Miliband out on BBC doing the round saying, towing the official line saying, it's for the royal family to make any further decisions on what else could happen. It's for the royal family. And that was sort of the line coming from government. Then you had, senior opposition MPs like Robert Jenrick breaking cover saying, his words, Prince Andrew is a disgrace and the taxpayer should not be doing anything for him anymore. He should be, out of sight, out of mind. Then you've had private members bill put forward. It feels like there's momentum growing. As much as the palace think that this is sort of subsiding, this story, it feels like Parliament and ministers and some members of Parliament are emboldened.
I mean, I wonder from your experience, do you think that the palace or the king, in a way, would almost kind of welcome it? You'd think he would not necessarily want MPs legislating about matters to do with his family, but, he might have a reluctance to take certain steps against his own brother for, brotherly loyalty reasons, but then actually having MPs...
Not sure how much of that there is.
Well, quite.
Left.
But having...
If there ever was, anyway.
Having MPs starting to militate in this way might give him the cover to say, I have to do this now because of the clamour.
I think there are two issues with it. I think what the first issue is, there is huge nervousness at the palace and in the royal family that if members of Parliament start debating this issue and actually do start talking about it, if there is a, if
with
there is an
parliamentary
inquiry,
privilege as well.
Exactly. Then what else might they start talking about in terms of the royal family? I think the second issue is there is probably a nervousness of, and I think probably unfounded, because I think this is so unique to Prince Andrew's sort of case, but there's possibly a nervousness that this would set some kind of precedent that Parliament might just start getting rid of titles left, right and centre when they feel like it.
I think this is the big question, and actually the Andrew question is almost forcing this matter now because of his refusal to sort of play by the old rules of convention.
Yeah.
That if pressure goes on you, you move out. I think the risk for the royal family is that people start talking about putting it on a more constitutional basis. Or we don't have a written constitution, a lot of it's by convention in the UK. And actually, are we going to start seeing a situation where MPs say, well, hang on a sec, we should have the power to say, we're not going to let Prince Andrew, just take, for example, live in the Royal Lodge. We should have the powers to regulate this stuff. And obviously at the moment, there's no power. They all sit with royal prerogative.
And it's bounced. It feels like the responsibility is bounced from Parliament to the royal family, back to Parliament, who say back to you, and it's not going anywhere. But people want something. It feels like that voluntary relinquishment of the titles doesn't feel like it's done the job.
No, and I think the wider problem here is around, again, we're talking about investigating royal finances. They're just so intransparent, use of trusts. I think the problem with all that is that obviously it keeps the royals, above reproach. It keeps a lot of those private matters out of the public sphere.
No one can ever see the wills. No one, there's so much darkness around the finances, as the Sunday Times has done with dispatches and the duchies.
You can't make a freedom of information request for like royal spending on things. And I think the problem the royals have got is now that this Andrew thing is now, they're trying to fix something with a convention, as in, he won't use the title. The public is going to get more and more sort of fed up with this, saying we don't want this person anywhere near public life, even in theory. And the risk is that MPs become more emboldened to say, well, actually, let's put them more on a statutory basis. Let's pass more laws that directly regulate how the royal families works. And I think, for some, I think that will put, at least, as you say, make things clearer and give the king an out on having to do this stuff.
I have to say, I'm sort of interested and surprised by the reticence of both Parliament and the royal family to explore this issue further in terms of stripping the titles, because a YouGov poll this week showed that 80% of the public would support that move. 80% of the public would support Prince Andrew actually being stripped of the titles, not them just going into, as the palace say, abeyance, because he still has them. And
including Prince or the Duke of York?
The Duke of York titles. And title and Order of the Garter and all that. And I think if the ever sort of changing purpose of the royal family is to try and test, litmus test the mood music of the public, and as far as Parliament's concerned, that's sort of how, they're elected on that. What's the reticence?
Yeah.
You know, is it because they're nervous about the precedent? I think it is.
Because what is kind of on the list? What could happen next in terms of saying, look, to Prince Andrew, these aren't just in abeyance, but we're formally kind of stripping them. Then obviously there's questions about the Prince title, which seems hard to imagine they would remove. And then the question of, line of succession. Can you see in the future the monarchy in this country taking a similar step to, say, in Denmark, where they've slimmed it right down to be it's the monarch and the direct heirs, and everyone else is a private citizen, essentially. How far could it go?
Well, Prince William has been talking a lot recently about change being on his agenda. I mean, there are big changes afoot if he wants to make them, and there's no doubt, absolutely no doubt, that he's very concerned about all of this. But it's setting up a lot of big unanswered questions down the line for his reign, for sure.
And I think this question with him as well is very obviously. Interesting in the Sunday, obviously, his team are now briefing quite carefully that, this will just end. We will sort this problem when I'm out. That puts Charles in a very difficult position because it's clear what's coming down the line.
Yeah.
So what happens next?
William does not want this problem in his in tray still.
No,
when
exactly.
He becomes king, and let's hope that's not for many years to come. But it's not solved at the moment.
And that begs the question, why not act now? Obviously, they did act on Friday, and that was quite a step. I know how the King's very reticent about taking more formal action, but it does beg the question, why not just go the whole way?
Just do it all in one.
Get on with it, because otherwise it's going to be drip, 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 drip.
And they could, if next week they take away one other thing, and then again the story just stays on the front pages for months.
Yeah.
I think one of the things as well, just thinking about it, when we were talking about sort of the American element, we saw and heard a lot from Amy Wallace this week, who's the co-writer of Virginia Giuffre's posthumous memoir, Nobody's Girl. There is something I think as well very powerful about hearing Virginia's words from beyond the grave. A lot of people have said there's nothing new in this book, but when you read her words, and she's no longer around, of course, she took her own life back in April, it becomes even more resonant. And I mean, Amy Wallace, the co-writer of Virginia Giuffre's memoir, said this week, she talked about what else he could do, how much more he could help. She said of Andrew, he was in those houses. He has information about other things that were going on. So yes, he could step forward if he were a different person and say, I feel terrible about this. And I want to say these women are telling the truth. And here's what I saw. And of course, Andrew has never done that. Despite when he signed that, multi-million-pound out-of-court settlement with Virginia Giuffre in 2022, admitting no liability, he said in a statement he would do everything he could to support victims of sexual abuse. But a lot of people have made the point, including Amy Wallace, he hasn't.
You made a really good point earlier about this kind of the sort of moral standing of the monarchy, and it comes back to the similar thing with the Church of England, as I was talking about, the idea that the Church of England has its bishops and archbishops in the House of Lords, and they will stand up and they will take a moral Christian perspective on housing or migration or welfare or whatever it might be, because that's kind of why they see that they're there. And clearly the monarchy as well will take a moral stand, and Charles will talk about the environment or talk about young people and opportunities and so on. And it's a linked thing where, however much affection there still is for individual royals, as there was for the late Queen or for King Charles, for the institutions now, their moral high ground is kind of vanishing.
Compromised.
And when they stand up and they say, I feel really strongly about this particular moral issue, they're going to say, yeah, but Andrew's still in the Royal Lodge or in the Church of England. They have you so, and so
the Queen and the Duchess of Edinburgh, both really passionate, long-standing campaigners and advocates of raising awareness around victims of sexual abuse.
Well,
how compromised will their work be going forwards?
Yeah, exactly.
Or how much more important will their work be going forwards?
So you've now, we're going to have a new Archbishop of Canterbury in place in a few months. A woman, the first woman. It'll be very fascinating to see when she first goes to meet the Pope, who gave her some quite warm words of welcome, but that will be a whole new dynamic. What will her relationship with the King be like, who is technically her sort of boss, supreme governor? Between them, there's and there were questions again with the whole constitution of when the scandals were happening, should the King have done more to step in, because he's the only person with the actual power to hire and fire, but he doesn't. That whole tying in through when the new Archbishop of Canterbury was named, it was Downing Street who then passes it to that kind of whole interplay between these sort of great
Church,
institutions
state,
of state,
yeah.
And now their moral high ground is evaporating, and what if anything can they do to restore trust in the kind of institutions that they represent, and their place in the whole system is going to be. I mean, Prince Andrew's still in line to the throne, clearly quite distant by this point, but those sorts of things do come up.
I want to ask you both, just as we sort of come to try and sort of draw some conclusions from this, as two reporters who are not royal reporters, when that statement from Prince Andrew came through last week and you could feel something quite huge was about to explode, how big a seismic moment did that feel, and has the last week felt in terms of shifting sands?
It did feel big. I mean, you're used to the royal soap opera, and you're used to the kind of, and William and Harry, and are they talking, and is Harry going to see the king when he comes back, and you kind of follow all of that. And then every now and again you get one of those stories which just lands. And I think the big thing is that people who probably have no interest in royal stories otherwise out in the public, they stop and they think this is a really big deal.
It's cut through, hasn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And it becomes interesting to see how, will the polls on republicanism, it's always existed in the UK as a kind of a minority. No one would ever think that the public would actually turn again. But is it going to tick up? We never thought the British public would vote for Brexit. Everyone thought, well, there might be a protest, and then it happened. Is this going to sway things like a tipping point?
Yeah.
How comparable is it to past crises in the monarchy?
Well, I mean, in terms of crises, I mean, I think if we look back, 1997, the death of Diana, Princess of Wales, was seen as a huge, seismic, sand-shifting moment for the monarchy, where perhaps, and for a rare moment in her life and her very long career as monarch, the late Queen Elizabeth didn't read the room, and then did read the room very quickly. And there's always been so much discussion about, Diana, what Diana taught the monarchy in life and death, that was a big moment. And, it was nearly a major crisis, which the royal family lost, but they sort of, they pulled it back. Do you think, George, this feels like a sort of similar moment where, unless lessons are learned, something will change, probably not in an ideal way for the royal family?
I think that's a big risk with this. I think that, as with the case of the death of Diana, the lesson learned there was the need to be more engaging with the public and actually share their grief. It's a very different situation to this, but it is that need to be connectedness. But obviously, as people who are unelected, by definition, you don't have to talk to the public in the same way. You have a big public role, but it's different to that of politicians. It's different to other institutions like that.
They needed to be humans rather than an institution, didn't they?
Exactly. And in some ways it's the same, that whatever the royal rules about the lease or whatever the rules about how monarchy is supposed to operate, through convention rather than the rules. I think this is a really an example where needing to be close to the public on this and be like, well, whatever the convention is, don't worry, just get rid of him. I think that's what a lot of the public are saying. And I think in a way there's that parallel, and also that now it's, as with Blair in 97, it's now spilled over into the political sphere where the Prime Minister is now being asked questions about this. It's a royal crisis when the Prime Minister is having to start commenting on this kind of things directly. So I think that this could be a crisis for them if they don't handle it more carefully. But in some ways, Friday was supposed to be the moment where they're saying, I think the King is very reticent to, take forceful measures, and his brother said, well, actually, at this stage, we just have to do something. But I just worry that maybe, as we've discussed, the public was expecting them to go a bit further. And I think that's how it may well play out in the next few weeks. Obviously, I don't have a crystal ball, but I think there is, as you said, the political momentum towards a stripping approach rather than just an abeyance. There may be further moves to attempt to get him out of Royal Lodge just by sort of putting pressure on him. But I think that that's the risk they have, is that they recognise it's an important moment, but maybe they don't quite, as the Queen didn't quite, recognise the kind of actions you need to take to re-establish your moral authority with the public.
I agree with you both. I think that this is a landmark moment for the monarchy. I think it is a ongoing, really difficult crisis for them that I don't think they've properly gripped yet. And I think if they don't, they risk permanently losing the public's trust. And, given that Prince William is so focused on the constant phrase he uses of having impact, but also of maintaining relevance and being modern. And as he said, recently, and as I was told and wrote in a piece, he wants to check the monarchy is fit for purpose. I think unless there are some very serious questions that are addressed and resolved after this, a lot of the public won't think that the monarchy is fit for purpose anymore. And that, I think, is the big concern for the king and for the future king going forwards.